Good morning, colleagues. I'd like to call the meeting to order. Members of the public are advised that our meetings are webcast live by the City of Hamilton and temporarily archived on the city's website. Other individuals and media may also be audibly or visually recording the meeting, as well as a reminder that all electronic devices are to be switched to a non-audible function during committee meetings. Clerk Pepperella, are there any changes to the agenda?
Yes, to you, Madam Deputy Mayor. 8.1, the 2020 tax supported capital budget that was deferred from the November 29th meeting is here. And a copy of 9.2, which was the Hamilton Police Services Board budget report that went to the last meeting, inadvertently got stuck to the back. I believe it was already removed from yours, but it may be in public copies, so it should just be discarded. The item that was listed as item 12.1, private and confidential corporate security office update. After review of the report, it was put as a public document, so is before you as 6.1 instead.
Thank you. May I please have a mover and seconder to approve the agenda as amended? Councillor Partridge.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to let everyone know for quorum purposes that I do have to leave at 10:30 for a meeting at 11. I will be back right after that. Thank you.
Thank you. So it was moved by Councillor Vanderbeek and seconded by Councillor Pauls. Any declaration? Oh, sorry, all those in favor, electronic vote, please. Declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? Seeing none, moving on to approval of the minutes from the previous meeting. Thank you. May I please have a motion to approve the minutes from the November 29th, 2019 meeting as presented, moved by Wilson, seconded by Pearson. All those in favor, electronic vote, please. That carries. Moving on to consent items. May I please have a motion to receive item 6.1? Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. Just some quick questions with regards to 6.1. And I do want to thank the staff because over the weekend they uploaded the reports that were listed, the security consultant reports to eScribe, so I was able to review a fair chunk of them. I'm trying to understand on a go-forward basis, because when I'm reading the report, it says in one area, it should be noted that none of the outstanding recommendations are critical to life safety and that high priority items have been addressed. The challenge when I was reading the reports was that there were a number of recommendations, and I'm not getting into the recommendations because those documents are dealing with security, which are in-camera issues. But I could not find any information as to which recommendations were approved, which recommendations were not approved, or where we stand currently on this list of reports that date back to, I think it was 2007.
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, that was one of the challenges, Councillor, with bringing the report. It was put together fairly quickly, and when the comprehensive security review is before you in February, I'm hoping that we'll be able to do a much better job in answering your questions with respect to any specific items that would have been in any of the appendices.
Councillor Clark.
So, thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. So if I can ask, I guess, the city manager then, so on a go-forward basis, how are we to deal with security issues? Because from my perspective as a governing body with oversight, I have to tell you, it was a little bit disconcerting to see so many reports, consultant reports, going back to 2007 dealing with security issues, and some of those security issues dealt with waterworks. So the Dundas Water Tower, the Ferguson Water Pumping Station, and there's a list of them, Garner Water Pumping Station and Reservoir. Those, in my mind, are crucial infrastructure to the municipality, and the consultants' reports were not shared with the council, and so we were never able to scrutinize what the recommendations were or how staff moved forward to mitigate them. So what's the proposal that you're going to bring forward in terms of how we're going to begin to ensure that that oversight is in place on a go-forward basis?
Through the Deputy Mayor. So my understanding is, in the past, the review of security of the different sites and operations was done by the individual program areas. And I have no, and they looked at them and brought budgets forward individually. There was a report brought forward by my predecessor looking at centralizing all those in one place and having a security office. So there's one oversight and looking at finding efficiencies, et cetera. And that's when the security office was formed under Public Works. This way, now, it will all be centralized. That office will bring reports to the senior leadership team about works that need to happen. And if there's significant safety issues that council should be aware of, then we'll be bringing those forward to council, and you'll get them through one program. But my understanding is, through those individual consultant reports, any urgent or significant security items were dealt with by the program.
Councillor Clark?
And I appreciate that, Madam Deputy Mayor. I guess the challenge is that when I read some of those reports, and it clearly identified issues that were of concern, but council was not informed. And so we don't know exactly what has been done or hasn't been done as of yet. And so on a go-forward, I know this is going back over a decade. I get that. That was the process. But going forward, we need to make sure that the process is very clear, that council is informed of these security reports, or the GIC or Public Works. It doesn't matter which committee gets it. There has to be some oversight. And so that on a go-forward basis, it's council that's making the determination on security recommendations and moving forward, as opposed to relying on staff doing it and then finding out later that there's been a breach and water was put at risk, for example, which is not going, based on what's happened internationally, that's not beyond the realm of possibility. So I'm just concerned, Madam Deputy Mayor, that we don't have a very clear process going forward, and I would like to see that come back in a report in terms of what committee is going to have that oversight and how we as a body get to review those documents.
Councillor Clark, would that be a motion, or City Manager, do you take that as direction?
It probably would be helpful to get it in a motion, so then it kind of goes on the OBL list, because we'll have to prioritize it with the other motions, because we're going to bring a prioritized list forward.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll come back to you, Councillor Clark, for a motion at the appropriate time. Councillor Partridge.
Yes, thank you. On page 2 of the report, it does say that the CSO will be returning to the General Issues Committee in February 2020 with the corporate security report. But along the same lines as the previous speaker's concerns, can someone explain to this council exactly what we can expect to see? It does indicate a more fulsome report. I don't know what that means. If I could just get a bit of a broader overview of that, please.
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, when we started the Corporate Security Office just under 2 years ago, one of the first actions was to identify all of those security assessments that have been done across different divisions within the city. They've been brought together, inventoried, and a prioritization was applied to all of them as far as threat risks to the different facilities and priorities. So Martin has spent a good period of time since he's arrived early in 2018, just putting all that together. So that's what's going to be before you in February, just that overall view of it, and then updates on the evolution of the security office. Martin was our first staffer in the office just under 2 years ago, and now we have 3 full-time staff and 2 temporary staff positions that we're in the midst of filling. So got a good number of people there now to bring this all together and to share with you where the program is.
Councillor.
And thank you. And I agree again with the previous speaker that, you know, certainly in light of what's happened over the last year, any of our facilities or parts of our system that are at risk, we need to be fully aware and on top of that immediately. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Marula.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Before we go on with the meeting, I think it'd be remiss of me not to mention that it's Councillor Jason Farr's birthday today. He turns 60 today.
For the public record, I know that the reference to the number is incorrect. Councillor Clark,
Happy 50th.
happy birthday.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. So can I, just before I turn my mind to any type of motion, can I just ask the city manager, because we approved a motion already with a policy and protocol to guarantee the sharing of consultant reports with council. So I don't want to do something that's redundant. We've already passed that motion. So can I ask when that protocol is coming back or that policy is coming back?
Through the deputy mayor. So with the approval of the disclosure framework and policy that was reviewed at AFNA, and I'm assuming will be approved at council tomorrow, that will be, or on Wednesday, that will be our overarching framework. And what we're planning to bring back in January is the protocol for sharing the consultants' reports and the protocol for orders that the city receives. And so then it's all in one place, one framework. So those two protocols will be coming. What I could suggest is that council sees those protocols in January and sees the report that General Manager McKinnon's bringing with the overarching security, now that we have it all in one place, and maybe then could decide whether council's looking for something additional and bring a motion forward then.
Madam Deputy Mayor, I'm fine with that recommendation since we already passed that other motion and it would simply be redundant at this point. Let's see what comes forward, and then if we're missing anything, then we can make amendments at that time. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. So moving on to consent item, may I please have a motion to receive item 6.1? Moved by Pearson, seconded by Vanderbeek. All those in favor? Carried. Moving on to our staff presentations. So General Manager Zagaric is going to present from the front bench, as the slide deck is only 2 slides deep, the 2020 tax-supported capital budget. And as soon as Mike is done, then we'll open up the floor for questions.
Good morning. Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. This is our second scheduled capital budget GIC, and if the capital budget is approved at committee today, it will go forward to council on Wednesday for approval. 2 weeks ago, we were before you with a presentation on the providing a summary on the 2020 tax-supported capital budget. Through those deliberations, with some conversation with Hamilton Police Services staff, we've revised the boards and agencies, more specifically the police capital budget request for 2020 from what was previously assumed at $1.73 million down to $1.28 million. And you can see the breakdown of the projects that represent the $1.28 million investment. Further down that slide, you may recall there were some discussions regarding one capital project, $500,000 for communication center expansion. That has been deferred by the Hamilton Police Services Board to their 2020 operating budget process. So again, what is before you and will be incorporated in the appendixes to the report will be amendments to the police 2020 capital budget, revising it from previously assumed $1.7 million down to just short of $1.3 million. So again, that brings our gross tax-supported capital budget and financing plan to $245,777,000, and that is attached as Appendix A to the report. And the financing changes as a result of the amendments to the Hamilton Police Services budget represents a decrease of $250,000 in net funding, as well as a decrease in development charge contributions of $250,000. So again, those will be amendments that are made to the attachments of the capital budget. And as Councillor Nan identified, it is a short presentation, only 2 slides. And again, staff are available as it relates to any questions that committee members may have regarding 2020 capital budget projects, as well as any forecasts for the period 2020 to 2023. And so we are in the hands of committee as to how you want to proceed. And again, staff are here to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, General Manager Zagarek. We have Councillor Wilson, then followed by the mayor.
Thank you very much, Chair Nan. Thank you, Mike, to you. I just primarily have initially some more macro questions as it pertains to the capital and the trajectory of our city and its sustainability. I premise my remarks by stating that since, at least in my recollection, the year 2000, we have been identifying one way or another an infrastructure deficit. And in tangent with that, we have always been calling for a more enhanced and predictable participating partner in the form of our senior governments, which, while we always welcome and appreciate their funding contribution, no doubt part of those funding contributions are in the form of unfunded mandates, which can sometimes take us off course of our identified priorities. So that is my backdrop. In the staff report, you identify that a healthy capital to operating ratio is about 15 to 20%. And you note in this report that we're finally getting to a platform of 13.1%. Is it this council's direction in the past, or are you requiring direction and a schedule of how and when we're going to be getting to a base of at least 15%? Through you, Madam Chair Nan.
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, the reference to Councillor Wilson's comments as relates to capital levy as a proportion of the overall levy, we've been at that 12 to 13% now for some time. And while over the last number of years we've increased the capital levy by 0.5%, that has not kept pace with what is required to achieve that 15% ratio relative to the overall operating levy. The challenge is balancing the need for capital investment with the overall tax affordability. And in the past, we've worked towards council's guideline as it relates to the overall residential tax increase, and that has constrained our ability to increase the capital levy over and above that traditional 0.5%. So in order to migrate to that, to a 15% ratio, we would have to move off of our traditional 0.5%. Now, we are moving off in the forecast. Let me see if we have our slides. I apologize. I know we had the November presentation. There was a slide in the November presentation, slide 24, that identified our forecast going forward. And you may recall that we identified 4 priorities. And the 4 priorities being housing, transit, roads, bridges, traffic, and our waterfront. We are forecasting over and above the 0.5%, but we're forecasting over and above the 0.5% principally to participate in the transit funding beyond 2020. So again, the 0.5% continues to be in our forecast. You may also recall that I mentioned that with that forecast is exclusive of those 4 areas, all the other program areas will be frozen for the next 10 years. I'm not sure how realistic that is in terms of an assumption, given some of this morning's conversations around corporate facilities and security, given the report that was part of the November agenda regarding roofs on some of our facilities and the deficit and the need to increase investment. So while we're forecasting a 0.5%, I expect as we continue to have discussions around state of good repair and around meeting our requirements under Bill 6, and council makes those decisions around service levels leading up to 2024 and the financing plans, I expect we'll have some conversations whereby there'll be options migrating or moving away from that 0.5%. So apologize for the length of the answer, but I expect we're going to be needing to have conversations regarding migrating off that 0.5%, in part because of the legislative requirements around Bill 6.
Councillor Wilson?
Thank you, Mike. Through you, Chair Nan. I don't want to put words in your mouth, Mike, but I just want to make sure I understood what you said. Are you kind of suggesting then that that schedule, we are handing that schedule over to the province to be in line with their requirements on the asset management, as opposed to taking the schedule in our own hands and seeing what our responsibility is in getting to 15 to 20?
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, the schedule is actually the provincial schedule. It's the requirements for all municipalities to achieve the level of reporting leading up to 2024. It's in the hands of committee. It's at committee's discretion to migrate off of that 0.5% capital levy increase. As I mentioned, we're currently at 1.1% for 2020, but over and above the 0.5%, the balance of that funding has gone towards leveraging funding for transit, housing, as well as our downtown accommodations, and to a lesser degree, our waterfront investments. So we're over and above that 0.5%, and as I mentioned previously, part of the challenge as it relates to investing over and above that 0.5% in capital is the overall direction from council as it relates to tax affordability. And given the guidelines that council has set for 2020 is going over and above that 1.1% will create some pressures as it relates to the operating budget if the expectation is to offset that increase on the operating budget.
Thanks, Mike. I have a supplementary question through you, Chair Nan. So you've mentioned, and it's been previously mentioned, about the balance between affordability and a healthy, sustainable ratio with an infrastructure deficit that keeps climbing and infrastructure that some of it keeps crumbling. I'd like to unpack, if I may, the whole principle of affordability. Have we done an analysis of two things? A comb through of all the possible revenue tools that may be available to this municipality, and then subsequently its impact on affordability in the city. Through you, Chair Nan.
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, I think it was back in 2017, staff brought forward a report to council at the time. It was during the provincial government's consultation process regarding potential amendments to the Municipal Act. And the consultation in part was focused in part on alternative policy options for municipalities around revenues. We did bring forward a list of revenue tools for council. That list was for the most part approved and supported, with the one exception was the land transfer tax was not supported at the time. And that list went forward to the province. Now, the province at that time, the provincial government, while they were in the midst of the consultation process, they did step back from those amendments as relates to the Municipal Act. So we have investigated opportunities surrounding tools such as tools that the City of Toronto has, but as well as we did put forward some amendments in regards to some tax policy decisions at that time, vacant commercial properties, as well as the issue that we dealt with last week was the vacant industrial commercial excess land and vacant land. We saw that there was a rationale and a benefit for eliminating that tax policy, which would provide some relief to residential properties and provide some incentive for occupancy to vacant buildings and creating some economic activity and eliminating some health and safety risks around those neighborhoods. The province did amend that legislation and it gave municipalities the authority to opt out of those tax policies, and we chose to opt out of that tax policy. So there was one minor amendment that the provincial government did proceed with, but again, back in 2017, we did review some options regarding alternative tax policies and revenue opportunities.
General Manager, Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Mike. That's very helpful. I'm on the land transfer tax, obviously, I think it's regrettable that we didn't look at it. I heard the opposition with respect to its impact on affordability, but I regret that it was done without further analysis and context, because a recent study of the Monk Center showed that it had no impact on the number of transactions. And if we are going to be guided by an issue of affordability, then arguably the impact is not on those entering home ownership for the first time. I thought our focus was on enabling home ownership for those in significant need, and also addressing the ability to finance deep affordable units. And I regret that that could have been a focus of a source of funding. So I think that context is important. On the vacant commercial vacant commercial properties, was there analysis done of vacant residential property tax, as in Vancouver?
Through Councillor, or
Sorry,
to
through you.
General Manager Zagaric about the residential vacancy tax policy that Vancouver recently passed. Actually, they've passed it for 2 years now, and they've increased it from a 1% to a 1.25%. General Manager Zagaric, I know you and I have been chatting about this offline, but to answer Councillor Wilson's question.
Thank you.
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, I don't believe that we've done a assessment, try to assess what the, if there are a significant number of units that are vacant. I think in Vancouver and Toronto, what was driving some of that experience was the speculation in the housing market and the fact that housing was being used as an investment, not necessarily just as shelter. And so in terms of the councillor's question, I'm not aware that we've done an assessment as to whether or not that's a problem or issue at the City of Hamilton.
So an assessment would be required to further identify whether or not speculation and vacancy of residences is an issue in our city, and then vice versa, whether or not a tax policy would be appropriate. Councillor Wilson, any other questions?
Thank you, Chair Nan. Through you to Mike and/or Jason, just so I have a better understanding, we've also identified the anemic growth of our commercial and industrial sectors as a way in which to try and offset the load being felt by our residential property owners and renters. Have we done, I should know this, have we done an assessment of what commercial, industrial, and manufacturer new entrepreneurs are looking for in terms of city magnets for their investment purposes as part of our efforts to enhance that? And secondly, do we have a summary of some of the incentives that we provide as part of that strategy? Through you, Chair Nan?
Yeah, so through the chair, we do collect that information annually. We do an annual employer survey, and the kinds of questions we ask are to identify if they are looking for to expand, to relocate, what their hiring intentions are, and in all of those situations, what the city can do, what the city can be provided to assist. I would suggest that it varies across sectors. In some cases, what is in relatively short supply is serviced shovel-ready employment lands. We have employment lands, significant employment lands designated around the airport, and we're gradually getting the servicing to those. There's a lot of demand for those lands at the moment, and we've seen a lot of activity in that area. The other things that we hear regularly for employers, especially employers in the business park areas, is around transit service is one of the things that they bring up quite frequently. And actually what we're hearing a lot lately, and recognize that this is more than just a municipal responsibility to respond to, but a skilled workforce comes up again and again, and what sort of training and development we're providing to the workforce. Those are a few examples. There's others. We do try to include, when we do our annual report on the Economic Development Action Plan, we do try to summarize some of those key issues that are being brought forward by the employers. But it is something that we do keep a pretty good handle on. In terms of growth in those sectors, there's that sort of issue of a step forward, step backwards. If we look at industrial construction in 2019, we are likely on pace to have our highest level in our history in terms of construction in industrial. What tends to set us back is reassessment in some of the commercial property owners. So in terms of new construction activity, we're actually very, very strong in ICI and particularly in 2019 in industrial. But the reassessments of some of the commercial properties do set us back.
Thank you very much, Jason. So my next question then is trying to understand how these policies and this, for example, the employment survey information and our Vision Zero corporate policy and the information that we have garnered from our health population annual reports, how do they impact our capital budget? Through you, Chair Nan.
So through the chair, with respect to one of the first issues I raised around shovel-ready employment lands, we do go through the capital budget and identify what are some of the key growth-related infrastructure projects that are required. And there are a number of those listed in the capital budget around servicing, especially around the employment areas. And we do provide input into some of the transit capital as well.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson.
So further to that, here's just a small example. So my understanding is that our sidewalk maintenance and new sidewalk has, the amount we earmark for that has not changed considerably, yet we have made a corporate commitment to Vision Zero, and we have been learning from Dr. Richardson that we are in fact generating costs for our city, for our province, and the nation because we have a population that unfortunately is too inactive and not able to move, maybe to the degree they should or they want. And I'm just trying to understand through this exercise how those corporate policies are being reflected and how they're influencing our capital budget. And I'm struggling to see that reflected in the budget.
As it's presented in front of you. Thank you.
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, I'll start, and I'm not sure if someone from Public Works might be available to expand on how the priorities were set in the roads, bridges, and sidewalks. What we've seen through that block of funding is that more of the funding is being directed where there are health and safety issues, principally in the area of bridges. And so while the overall funding envelope for roads is relatively stable for 2020 and is forecast to increase by about 4% annually in 2021 to 2023, is because of the safety issues surrounding bridges a greater proportion of the overall block funding is going towards bridges, which limits the amount of funding available for other areas such as sidewalks as well. In the past, there's been some targeted investments around traffic and traffic operations over the last number of years. So again, sidewalks is part of that overall block for roads, bridges, traffic, and sidewalks. And part of the challenge is that sidewalks, for instance, is competing with those other program areas, namely traffic and bridges.
Thank you, Mike. I guess I had this feeling last year walking into it, and I have a feeling this year walking into it. I don't know, frankly, what our financial plan is. I don't know where we, as a corporation and as a community, have a plan to address the infrastructure deficit, with the exception of continuously going cap in hand to senior orders of government, as we should, because they have vacated their province building and nation building responsibilities as it pertains to cities, which are the economic engines. But I don't know. I think we have to, as a city, make some sort of plan in place that says by this year we are going to at least enter into the plateau of the 15 to 20%. And we are going to do another thorough review of our revenue generation tools, and we're going to assess them according to these affordability principles and their possible impact. And our budget, corporately and capitally, are going to clearly reflect our corporate priorities, which are Vision Zero, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and the third pillar, of course, being climate change. So I'm still struggling with this budget, and I think it is more important than the operating budget because of how it drives that. And I'm feeling a little like I don't have much of an impact or influence, and I don't know how I would be held accountable for whether it does or does not adhere to those three corporate pillars, and how I would be held accountable for that. So those are my comments. I look forward to what my other colleagues say.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. And just as chair to the rest of the committee, giving leniency, as today is the only day that we have the remainder of our opportunities to ask questions related to capital. So I am going to give leniency for councillors to just get out all the questions you have in order to move through repeat versus having repeats. So moving on is Mayor Eisenberger.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't have any questions, and at the appropriate time, I will move to approve the capital budget, but I don't want to do that and preempt Councillor Collins and Councillor Jackson, so I'll wait for that motion at that point. But I did want to acknowledge someone in the room here that is going to be retiring and has helped us through our budgeting and specifically capital budget process for many decades, and that would be one Joe Speiler, who has been a fantastic job. We want to thank him very much for all of his decades of service to our community, and of course, this being the final budget meeting that he'll be attending, we wish him well into retirement. So at the appropriate time, Madam Chair, though, if you'll come back to me, I will be more than happy to approve the capital budget unless there are amendments that are coming forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Collins.
Thanks, Madam Chairman. I was going to ask Mike, with the reduced numbers associated with, I believe in his opening statement, he mentioned the library and police have submitted capital budget numbers that were less than we anticipated. I wondered whether there was an opportunity on the DC side to look at phasing in some of those pressures that we anticipated in 2020.
General Manager.
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, the changes as it relates to the capital projects for Hamilton Police Services and some provisions we set aside for 2020 for library does create some funding capacity. You may recall when I was before committee in November as well, I identified we've set aside a provision for the recreation, culture, and communities ISIP grant projects. So assuming that we don't encroach on the ISIP funding, so that we have that funding set aside, if we hear positive news from the other levels of government, one option is, and let me see if I can pull up the breakdown of the 1.1%. I'll just get to slide 24 here. So if it's the will of committee is we could earmark the funding that's been freed up as it relates to the boards and agencies and the provision that we had set aside for some in-year potential pressures in 2020. If it's the will of committee, we could earmark that funding, which represents about $2 million, and we could defer the DC, oops, sorry. I'm trying to hit the laser here and I'm hitting the forward button. You could defer the 0.23% on under 2020. You'll see the second bottom line there, and this is the DC exemptions. So what it would allow is that $2 million now would be earmarked for DC exemptions, and we could bring back the DC exemption funding increase to 2021. As Jason's identified, 2019 looks to be a strong development year. Deferring it for 2021 is if there is a market adjustment, we would report back if there are any options to phase in the $2 million enhancement or pressure. So if it's the will of committee is we could realign the funding for those provisions to funding the DC exemptions, and that would in effect take our 1.1% 2020 increase down to I believe it's about 8.87%.
0.8 point.
Or sorry, 0.87%.
Thanks, Mike. Is that something that staff supports or would support if it was the will of committee?
Yeah. Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, I would be supportive, or I would say staff would be supportive, as long as that $2 million in provision funding was set aside for the DC exemptions. It would keep us whole for 2020 with I'm assuming, direction to report back in 2021 and as it relates to development and the continued need for the additional $2 million. I'll just remind committee what drives that overall level of funding requirement is not only the pace of development, but our exemptions. And through our last DC background study report and through the development of the bylaw, council took a number of more sustainable measures towards our DC exemptions. So we're in a better position going into 2020 than we've been historically. But again, it would be subject to the pace of development, and we could report back in 2021 as to what we're expecting around development and the need for DC exemption funding.
Okay, then I would move that at the appropriate time, if I have a seconder on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on to Councillor Jackson.
Thanks, Madam Deputy Mayor. And before I just get to some final global and parochial comments or questions, Director Speiler, you know the round of applause and nice recognition you got. After today, just let folks know who actually attended your pre-retirement party. Thanks, Joe. Okay, Madam Deputy Mayor, can you turn to, Mike Segarra, can you turn to slide 7, please? Anyways, it's all there on the record, whoever signed the book. Anyway, so, Madam Deputy Mayor, Okay, so I always like to make sure I understand completely before approving a budget to the best of my ability, Madam Deputy Mayor. Mike, refresh my memory, the third bullet point, that's a large number. What falls under other, please? Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor.
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, we can compile the list. I'm not sure if the councillor has other questions, and as the councillor is asking those questions, it's a number of program areas that would make up the 10%. And again, we can provide, I can get staff to compile that list of program areas and projects.
Okay, that'd be great then, Mike, thank you. And Mike, to slide 14, please. Thank you for recalling here your November 29th initial presentation. Okay, so slide 14. Mike, again, I just want to reiterate the ISIP federal program that I think we had about 40 overall projects on for consideration from rec, from tourism, from facilities, and the federal transit, roughly $500 million, if I recall, that we said we were in play for with the federal program. If we were successful again, Mike, on both sides of it, whatever contributions are necessary, you have parked X amount of dollars in anticipation, so we don't have to reconsider this capital budget down the road. Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, please.
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, if I can break down my answer to those two programs, ISIP programs. With respect to the transit ISIP program, you recall that committee in October deliberated and approved that financing strategy. So what I've reflected in the 2020 capital is the financing strategy that would fully meet the city's expected contribution if other levels of government were to support the city's ask. So as it relates to the 2020 to 2023 funding strategy, that the 2020 is incorporated in the forecast.
Good.
And as it relates to the 2021 to 2023 forecast, it's fully incorporated in that forecast as well. So the city would be meeting its obligation approximately just short of 27% of the gross funding under those strategies. With respect to the recreation, culture, and community ISIP intake, we've set aside $5 million towards our ask. I would expect some of those projects would be debt funded, some contribution funded. You'll recall that I believe the overall ask was somewhere in the area $135 million. Unlike the transit, there wasn't a allocation that the city was working towards. We estimated if it was based on a per capita, the city could expect to receive somewhere in that $30 to $35 million mark. So we feel comfortable that the $5 million provision will see us through 2020.
Terrific, Mike. All forecasted, budgeted, and anticipated very wisely. Thank you, Mike, for those assurances. Mike, are there any, as you have with operating budgets and tax appeals that have whacked the city from time to time, from a capital standpoint, are there any dark clouds on the horizon, Mike, that like maybe staff are looking at or may be forthcoming in the future, or hopefully not, but is there anything that we should be possibly even prepared for without getting panicked over? Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor.
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, I'll recall my comment earlier this morning is our 10-year capital forecast aligns very much to leveraging funding from other levels of government. So that's the transit, the housing, the culture, recreation, community. In addition to that is the deficiencies around our roads, bridges, and sidewalks, and finally the opportunities around the West Harbour. And as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, as well as this morning, that effectively freezes all the other program areas. And I'm not sure how reasonable of an assumption that is, that all other service areas will be able to continue to deliver their programs at the same level of funding that they receive in 2020, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. So the risk that represents, it's the risk that in part there was a companion report to our November agenda, and that was the roofs with respect to some of our corporate recreational facilities. And then the companion report today identifies some security. Those are all outside of our funding, our affordable funding envelope, and those are examples of some of the pressures we expect we're going to have to report back to committee going forward and starting in 2021 as to how to balance those pressures within some of the constraints we're facing, the financing constraints we're facing, and all the competing demands. So as it relates to the question around risks or dark clouds, there will be risks going forward. It'll be discussions that we'll bring forward to committee as it relates to reprioritizing funding to programs, or the alternative is to increase the level of capital levy funding.
Okay, thank you, Mike. And although capital and operating are distinctly separate, but capital feeds the operating, if I support this capital budget going forward today with Councillor Collins' amendment, Mike, is our AA rating, as far as you know, still in play and still hopefully reinforced, Madam Deputy Mayor, through you, because that's an important message to the community in spite of the infrastructure deficit that we're dealing with, especially as in parts of our city as an older municipality. Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, please.
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, I would expect with, if there were to be an amendment, I expect that it would not affect our credit rating. So our credit rating in part recognizes the fact that we are a mature municipality with infrastructure challenges. There is a 0.5% capital levy increase built into our current 1.1 or potentially 0.87. So I would expect that that would be reflected and appreciated in terms of a continued effort to try to address the infrastructure deficit, but as well as there's recognition that tax affordability as well is a priority of council.
Great. And to be parochial now for just a couple of mountain and East Mountain projects, Madam Deputy Mayor, again, we heard 10 days ago on behalf of Councillor Pauls and Danko and myself, thrilled to hear that Director McGuire, if this capital budget's approved, the environmental assessment and design of expanding Rymal Road from Dartnall all the way to Upper James is included. And I'm thrilled about that money that's embedded in this budget and much needed. And hopefully, once that process is concluded, it's a 2023 timeframe for beginning construction, but maybe between the Ward 6, 7, and 8 councillors, we can find a way to accelerate the funding for that if possible with council support. And lastly, Mike, under Parks and Open Space, Mike, you know that I've got a couple of projects, Broughton East and the former Henderson Barton site, that will be soon deemed for closure and the for sale sign put up. So I'm just asking, Mike, in the Parks and Open Space budget, or maybe in the Parks Reserve budget or land acquisition for parks, Madam Deputy Mayor, I'm putting my 2 sites on the table, putting this term of council on notice, both projects I've been working on since the last term of council, so going back 4 or 5 years, are projects such as like that to preserve open space for neighborhoods and communities, to repurpose a school from falling into private development hands unnecessarily. Are they all anticipated, Mike, in this budget moving forward? Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, please.
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, staff recognized the fact that school boards will be divesting themselves of a number of properties starting in 2019, 2020. I believe the one school board, the public school board, has about a dozen properties that they've identified that may be divested. So not knowing what the community needs are with respect to those properties, but knowing that in the past, council has expressed an interest and a will to acquire some of that space, either for green space. We have set aside $2.5 million as part of our 2020 capital financing strategy, and in the past, the practice has been, it's been a bit of a blended approach to those acquisitions. We've relied in part on area rating, on the Parkland Acquisition Reserve, as well as some development reserve funding if appropriate. So again, traditionally, it's been one funding source towards a solution, and we have earmarked about $2.5 million in 2020 as it relates to those potential potential properties that are coming forward through the school board divesting of their properties.
Thank you very much, Mike, that it hasn't been forgotten and you've got it on your radar. And again, Madam Deputy Mayor, with both the Broughton East Park site and with the Barton Henderson site, communities' petitions have already been forwarded to my office several years ago. And I'm just putting this term of council on notice that wherever I can, I always contribute my own AR reserve funding to help as well, if necessary, to purchase the site. But overall, Madam Deputy Mayor, from the answers I've heard, the studies I've done, I think this is a reasonable, sound, prudent capital budget going forward. And again, we do desperately still need help from federal, provincial governments. Thanks, Madam Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Jackson. We're going to move to Councillor Clark, and then I'm adding myself as a first-time speaker, and then the Mayor, and then Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. With regards to fleet, it's indicated that it's about $10 million is what we're proposing for fleet in 2020. Is there any policies in place in terms of moving towards vehicles that are not internal combustion engines?
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, there's no framework that we follow currently. I would say it's practice that when we are replacing vehicles for different divisions, we are encouraging them to look at what's leaving the tailpipe. For example, they could be using smaller vehicles, that kind of thing. That is on the work plan for 2020 to come up with a more aggressive and comprehensive strategy about moving the entire fleet to be a greener fleet.
Thank you, and I sincerely appreciate that. With regards to the core asset, when I look at the core infrastructure assets and the total envelope is $20 billion worth of assets that we currently have within the city of Hamilton, and I see the breakdown, and I see roads are at 24%, bridges at 6%, and then it breaks it all the way down. When we're developing our capital budget, it's not based on any set ratios of what our core assets are. It's set on the priorities and the state of repair of the infrastructure. Is that a fair statement?
Madam Deputy Mayor, that's fair, yep.
So then how does, and this might be a longer answer than we want for today, but how do we prioritize all of those competing demands with a limited budget?
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, each of the buckets, if you will, get prioritized individually. Certainly the Bill 6 requirements that are on us to come forward with the levels of service will help to clarify that. There is still, if I can allude to Councillor Wilson's question, so if we look at the work that we do on sidewalks, if you take out a slab of sidewalk, you could argue that you're doing it for state of good repair. You could argue that you're doing it for to satisfy AODA requirements, or that you're satisfying Vision Zero. So some of these works coincidentally serve 2 or 3 different masters, and we've never gone through the exercise to identify which priority it's serving the most. But as we work through the new regulations around asset management, we're going to seek to bring more maturity to that conversation.
Councillor Clark?
And the new regulations around asset management, that's province-wide, and it seems to me that the motivation was that Hamilton isn't the only municipality with an infrastructure deficit. Cumulatively across the province, the infrastructure deficit for municipalities is staggering.
Yep.
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, that's correct. I would argue across the entire country, if not the continent.
So it's not just Hamilton that's been wrestling with this over the years.
For you, Madam Deputy Mayor, I would say no. And just as a reminder, is municipalities account for 60% of all the infrastructure that governments are accountable for, yet we only share in about 8 cents for every tax dollar. And so the majority of the responsibility lies with municipalities, but we're limited with respect to the funding tools that we have to address infrastructure.
We have 60%, you said, of all of the infrastructure. And how much are we getting funding from the senior levels of government? Did you say 8%?
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, municipalities realize about 8% or 8 cents for every tax dollar that taxpayers pay. So for every dollar that taxpayers pay to all levels of government, we realize about 8 cents.
And yet 60 cents is the actual infrastructure that's within our domain.
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, there is a bit of a disconnect as relates to,
We're always so diplomatic, Mike.
there is a disconnect with respect to the reliance on municipalities to ensure that our infrastructure is in place, not only for public safety, but in order to help facilitate development and growth in industries and jobs with the revenue tools that we have available to us.
I have to say, over my lifetime, I found it always frustrating that senior levels of government are making decisions and then quickly point fingers at the municipalities that they're not doing the job. And yet the funding levels have been shrinking over time. All levels of government, all parties that have been in power have done exactly the same thing over that period of time. In my time on council, I have watched the roads budget from the provincial government shrink dramatically, and it gets switched over to transit and higher order transit at a much higher level than they were ever funding roads, leaving the municipality with the challenge of fixing the roads that they have, and they don't have the money to do it. And we can't raise taxes to the level that would be required to fix all those roads because there's absolutely no way that the residents in the city of Hamilton could pay those taxes. So it is a real dichotomy and conundrum, most of which that has been caused by senior levels of government. And I know I'll get attacked by some saying, well, you're pointing fingers at the senior levels of government. I'm simply stating facts, Madam Deputy Mayor. This has been the history. I'm not making things up. This is the way it's been, and we have real challenges when we're trying to fix the roads in the community. On a parochial level, I do want to thank the staff. I understand that Ramel Road is now, and Highway 56 is in Councillor Johnson's area. They're going to be widened in 2020 and finished up in 2021. And the Mud Street Bridge, we talked about bridges. There's a bridge that needs some assistance, and that's happening in 2020 also. So we are gradually improving the assets within my ward, as in other wards across the city, within the ways and means that we can actually pay to get it done. And I continually use the analogy, Madam Deputy Mayor, years ago, my roof was leaking and my fence needed repairs, and a pool guy came to the door saying, I can get you an indoor pool 50% off. Well, tempting as it was, the 50% off now, buy now, and put off the roof and put off the fence, we didn't go down that road. We repaired the fence, we repaired the roof. We still don't have an in-ground pool. Love to have an in-ground pool, ain't gonna happen, can't afford it. We have to prioritize, is my point. And that's what we have to do as a council all the time, and it's very challenging. And some folks don't always agree with the decisions that we're making, but I think at the end of the day, we are making balanced budget decisions as we move forward. So I'll support this moving forward. I also support Councillor Collins' motion, amendment at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you. Pass the chair to Councillor Wilson. Just a couple of questions, similarly off the last few speakers, in terms of the dichotomy we are facing as a municipality between our necessary to-haves versus not even entertaining or in the realm of the nice-to-haves, and the challenge of tax affordability and the challenge of revenue generation as a municipality. So over the course of the last year, I've been really trying to better understand what are the available revenue generation tools that a municipality has, and what limits cities like Hamilton from pursuing policies, tax policies, or other revenue generating tools that we often hear about in the news that other municipalities across the country or even the United States might be applying, especially as it relates from a framework of need to have. And if a need to have priority framework that this council has passed is climate and EDI, fundamentally what we're talking about here is about integrating equity and climate into our existing budgeting process. So reconfirming the understanding from the last GIC meeting is that whatever our climate action targets and goals are going to be moving forward, that our city is going to use our existing capital, our existing operating budgets in order to try to accomplish those. So that was a clear understanding from me at the last GIC versus some of the nice-to-haves, which might be a large-scale, brand-new project that isn't on the roster of being approved yet, which isn't attempting to bump the line as per our existing capital priorities, but might be a necessity based on some unforeseen circumstances as it relates to climate, and we'll have to cross that bridge if we are in that kind of situation moving forward. So to staff, I was just curious, Mike, we've had some great emails back and forth over the last couple of weeks around revenue generation tools, and I know it's an area that residents in Ward 3 are often asking me about. I was wondering if we could just take a few moments, if you don't mind, identifying some of the opportunities and limits that a municipality like our city faces when it comes to implementing new revenue generation tools like other new tax policies or otherwise.
So through the chair, and I'll try not to be long because I expect I could spend the morning talking about tax policy and revenue tools. The authority for municipalities in Ontario to impose either policy changes or fees, charges, taxation is fairly limiting, with the exception of City of Toronto. City of Toronto has a suite or a menu of some unique revenue tools that other municipalities do not have. So as it relates to Ontario municipalities, what you'll see is that for the most part, we are approximately 50%, somewhere in the area, 45 to 65 province-wide, of our revenue basis is through property taxes. The balance is principally through fees and charges, and that's principally water, wastewater, fees and charges, stormwater in those municipalities that have stormwater, development charges, and other third-party fees and charges. So we're fairly limited as it relates to how we fund not only our capital, but our operating. What affects municipalities a little differently is a bit of our history. So in the case of City of Hamilton, when previous provincial governments imposed ratios, tax ratios, they imposed tax ratios that reflect the provincial expectation around fairness of tax burden. And so for each municipality, it affects us a little differently. In the case of City of Hamilton, post-amalgamation, immediately after amalgamation, our industrial and our commercial were effectively referred to as protected classes, meaning that the city could only transfer on 50% of the tax increase onto those classes. Through some policy changes and some programs, some business retention programs here at the City of Hamilton, we are able to get the commercial class below that fairness ratio or threshold. So now we are able to pass on 100% of the property tax increase onto commercial. The large industrial continues to be a protected class. I would suggest if our tax increases going forward are consistent with what they've been over the last 10 years, that our large industrial class will continue to be a protected class probably for another 2 decades before we bring them below that fairness ratio. So that will continue to be a limited opportunity for the city as to passing on that future increases onto that class. What you've heard me reference in the past is, again, each municipality is having different experiences, but at the City of Hamilton, through 2016 to date, we've had a strong residential sector, strong real estate experience in the residential sector, outpacing the growth in the non-residential, so there's been a transfer of burn, a shift of burn onto the residential. I mentioned earlier, we've mitigated some of that through the vacancy credit for commercial, and I expect at council tomorrow council will ratify the elimination of the excess and vacant land credit for commercial industrial. So that assists residential, that transfers some burden. It's not additional revenue, it just simply transfers burden from the non-res, from the res onto the commercial and industrial. And it's fairly limited. Those are approximately 400 properties, so not all of commercial industrial. The other provincial requirement is that as relates to multi-residential, they are effectively a protected class in that for a number of years now, because of the strong multi-res market, principally in the GTA, principally in Toronto, the province has imposed a restriction on municipalities whereby we cannot reflect the reassessment shifts in multi-residential, nor the tax increases onto the multi-residential. So now I believe this is the third year, if not fourth year, that class is protected both in terms of reassessment and in terms of tax increase. Now, the one challenge that will create is if that policy ever changes, and for instance, reassessment is allowed to be passed on, that will create a huge impact, because effectively you've had a class that's been protected for 4 years, and when you eliminate that protection and that you have now reflecting current market values, that could represent a significant risk for that class. So I would expect we would have to work with the province in terms of phasing that in over an extended period if the province were to loosen that restriction. So those are some of the tax policy challenges. I mentioned earlier through Councillor Wilson's question, we did review some tax revenue opportunities back in 2017. The provincial government at that time stepped back from some of those consultations and didn't want to pursue those, so those continued to be outstanding for most municipalities with the exception of City of Toronto. Sorry, all municipalities with the exception of City of Toronto. So I hope that's answered through the chair, I hope that's answered Councillor Nan's question with respect to some of the revenue opportunities, limitations, and some of the unique tax policy experiences here at the City of Hamilton.
Thank you, through the chair. I appreciate that. And I guess I want to pick up on the final piece around the vacant properties. I think it's essential. I'm looking forward to ratifying, eliminating the credit in order to, as you mentioned, it's not additional revenue, but to take the revenue impact off the residential tax levy and put it where the class, onto the class that it deserves to be on. In terms of vacant residential property taxes, you had mentioned earlier, General Manager Zagarek, that there needs to be some sort of assessment done to identify how much of a problem it may be in our city that folks are sitting on vacant residential properties in order to speculate land and increase profit. And for me, I guess the challenge I have is if that is a situation going on in our city, while we are balancing a pretty dire situation that's across the country, but particularly in our city around affordable housing, I know that other municipalities have allocated vacant residential property tax revenue specifically to affordable housing, and I'm curious through the chair if it would be feasible to see about assessing, moving a motion to call for that assessment and to look at what options might be available to us as a city and what kind of potential revenue may be generated as a result to help offset our affordable housing costs. Through the chair to staff.
Through the chair, it may be helpful just in terms of managing workload if the direction were first to report back as to the feasibility for the municipality to impose some form of direct taxation onto vacant residential properties in an effort to to encourage occupancy of those. So prior to undertaking a assessment, given that I'm assuming that would require some resources and investment, is first discovering whether or not we have that authority to impose a fee or charge. Report back with those findings at that time is if we do have such authority, it would likely warrant having some further investigation as to whether or not that we're having the same experience that other municipalities, namely Toronto and Vancouver, might be having.
So at the appropriate time through the chair, I'd like to be able to move that feasibility motion. Back to the speakers list, we have, Mayor Eisenberger.
Thank you. So I will put forward a motion to approve the capital budget and await for Councillor Collins' amendments. And if I could get a seconder for that, just to get it on the floor, and then the amendment's going to happen. Thank you, Councillor Marula. And then just a quick comment. Much appreciated all the effort, time and effort it goes into putting this capital budget together in terms of all divisions. And then obviously filtered through Mike and his team. Always a challenging effort, given the kind of financial circumstances we find ourselves in. And I can tell you that the conversation around revenue tools and a different kind of financing regime on both the federal and provincial side is an ongoing one. So at the Big City Mayors Conference, it is a constant topic of conversation that we deliver to the federal government, that there needs to be a different taxing regime, whatever that might look like, where municipalities can have more predictable sources of funding. And I'll give a little credit to the current government that has upped the ante in terms of gas tax revenues. So they've doubled and are promising to double again the gas tax revenue going forward. And I think that's certainly a positive step. But it doesn't really answer the question of, the funding formula the way it sits today, which is basically 50, 40, 10, or 8, 50% going to the federal government, 42% to the province, and 8% of the overall tax load coming to the municipality. There's definitely something wrong with that picture, and I can assure you that that's a constant topic of conversation. And until such time as we get that one addressed, we just have to continue to prioritize our capital spending based on affordability and kind of practical realities about what we can achieve, as opposed to what we don't have that we can't use to achieve the greater good. So I want to thank all participants in creating this capital budget. It's always a challenge, and I think we're well served to put this one behind us and get on with, I think, the next step, which is then the operating budget. So I'm happy to move it. Thank you, Councillor Marula, for the second, and I'll look forward to Councillor Collins' amendments.
Thank you, Mayor. We have Councillor Wilson and then Councillor Collins.
Thank you, Chair Nan. I just want to make sure I understand the answer that was given to one of my colleagues when talking about moving forward on our vehicle purchases. So on page 135, for example, of Planning and Economic Development, it talks about vehicle purchases for licensing and bylaw services. So just so I understand, is it the corporate policy that we begin with hybrid, or will it be moving forward to include in the scope electric? Or can you just reiterate that for me, please, through you, Chair Nan?
Through the chair, at the moment we're working through going through hybrids, but we are working aggressively as a 2020 work plan to go to more of a greener fleet, to, for example, electric vehicles. So we are putting together a committee together, like a staff committee, to discuss that potential.
Okay, great, thank you. Through Chair Nan to, I think, Dan. I'm sorry, I should have asked you this offline, but for example, there is or maybe it's Jason, a school crossing review on page 138 of the capital budget. and it's reviewing, we have a difficult time, as I understand it, securing school crossing guards, and we are having residential growth, which is also increasing their demand. So this review is going to look at ways and means to try and reconcile that. As part of that review, Jason, are you able to tell me now, or maybe you have to tell me later, will we be looking at both the actual design of the crossings physically?
So through the chair, the intent of the review is really to look at where guards are required and where they are not. The last time a comprehensive review was done citywide of all crossing guard locations was something like 15 years ago. So we do an annual review where we look at if there's been a change in a lunchroom program, something like that, that affects school crossing needs. We do that on an ad hoc basis year by year. We haven't gone back and comprehensively reviewed staffing at all locations for quite some time. So that would be the focus of this review. It was not intended to look at actual crossing design, street design standards, things of that nature.
Councilor Wilson?
Okay. That's unfortunate, I think, in terms of a lost opportunity. So I'll pursue that another venue. I did have a question with respect to also, for you, Jason, on page 141. It identifies natural areas acquisition fund is not included in the financing plan. Could you just tell me what natural areas in this case might mean? Through you, Chair Nan.
Yes, through the chair. So this was a program that was actually approved by council back in 2009 or 10. It was directed to staff to develop a program to have city funding for the acquisition of natural areas by primarily conservation authorities or NGOs who acquire natural areas for the purpose of conservation and protection. Staff developed the program. It was approved in 2014 with some initial seed funding that the city could then grant out to those conservation agencies. The initial funding was spent, I believe, about 2 years ago. So we have not had an intake to that program since those funds were spent. And this, this item is currently unfunded, so that would continue until there was funding approved for the program.
Thank you. So just, was there in the 2009-2010 report, was there an identified need for this kind of fund?
Through the chair, there was, and we did have in 2015, I believe it was, when we announced the first intake of applications. We did have 2 or 3 applications. I believe they may have all come from the Hamilton Conservation Authority. I'd have to go back and check my records. That had some acquisitions approved for the budget that was available.
And I trust it's not being funded for financial reasons then.
Through the chair, that's correct.
Thank you. Thank you. One final question on the particulars, Chair Nan, to Mr. McKinnon. Under forestry on page 203, the tree planting program, we identify the need to increase our canopy from 21 or something % to 35. Yet our earmarked monies for tree planting is consistent up until 2029, and I'm wondering, how do you reconcile that for you?
Madam Deputy Mayor, so this program relates to trees that are either on city property or within the municipal right-of-way, and we can lose trees for a variety of reasons, including storm damage or pests. Certainly the emerald ash borer is having a dramatic effect across the city. This program provides for the replacement of trees, whether it's to replace an ash tree that's been taken down, or if a homeowner decides they'd like to see a tree on their property. Typically in a year, we increase the inventory of trees that exist on municipal right-of-ways or on municipal property. So the actual inventory is growing every year. When it comes to the actual canopy, we're not making a lot of progress on that as a result of the fact that the newer trees are obviously much smaller, and often they're replacing a much older tree that has a much bigger canopy. But as far as the inventory of trees that exist within the city, within the city's purview, it's grown by about 4,400 trees over the last 4 years.
Thank you. So just so I understand what you just said, we're not able to meet our canopy target, but you said our inventory is increasing. I'm not sure I understand. Thank you.
Yeah, through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, just to make the distinction, the number of trees are growing within the city's portfolio, but because the newer trees are obviously much smaller, they're not replacing the canopy at the rate that we'd like to see. So it's going to take an extended period of time to achieve our canopy goal, because currently we're using the canopy as the measure of success when it comes to our forestry program.
Thank you, Dan. Through you, Chair Nan. So we have an urban tree strategy that will be coming up in 2020, and there will probably be a budget discussion in and around that then?
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, we can certainly put that on the work plan to make it a point of conversation through the next year.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. So I also want to just clarify the path forward. So we have an amendment by Councillor Collins, seconded by Councillor Clark. We have the main motion in terms of the 2020 tax-supported capital budget report moved by the mayor, seconded by Councillor Marula. We have a motion also that I'd like to add to the floor. Clerk Paparella, just to be clear about the decision-making path moving forward, and then Councillor Pauls has a question.
So through to you, Deputy Mayor Nan, I believe that the mayor's motion right now is to put the report on the table.
Mm-hmm.
So you can put all the amendments now. At this point, I don't think it matters really what order they
Sequence?
go in.
Fair enough.
You have Councillor Collins that you're aware of, so you can do him first or second, and as well you have Councillor Marula's. Any others should come after those two.
Got it. Thank you.
All going to affect the same report.
Thank you so much. Councillor Pauls. Oh, sorry, my apologies.
Thank you. I just, thank you. I just want to I want to circle back, please, with my opening remarks so I understand. Going back to the 15 to 20% plateau through you, Chair Nan, to Mike, I think what the report reads is that prior to amalgamation, we were in that area. And we have since moved from that area down to 11%, now in and around 13%. I just want to clearly understand that we have, or do we have, a plan and a schedule that would see us appreciating that all municipalities have infrastructure deficits, but I thought what I read in your report was that most are in that 15 to 20% area. Do we have a schedule or a plan that would see us get back into that realm? Through you, Chair Nan.
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, we have a capital financing plan that assumes 0.5% and over and above the 0.5% for some targeted investments. As to whether or not that will bring us to 15%, a ratio of 15%, I would suggest it likely will not. It'll be subject to what the tax increases, overall tax increases are over that time period. But if the tax increases range somewhere between 2 and 4%, is that 0.5% will not be sufficient to bring us to that 15% ratio.
Thank you. So through you, Chair Nan. Mike, would it be possible if I had to move in a motion for you to bring back some sort of feasibility of the possibilities and schedule for us to get there, knowing that there are, of course, moving parts with respect to senior orders of government? Is that doable for you?
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, if the direction or motion would be for staff to report back through the 2021 maybe guideline report, as we can provide that content to help form part of the conversations leading up to the 2021 budget guideline.
Okay, so I'll be moving that, Madam Chair. The other question, back to my opening remarks, Mike, is do you require a motion so that during the future capital budget deliberations, the corporate pillars passed by this council, Vision Zero, climate change, EDI, are the guiding principles for this, for the next capital budget deliberation? Through you, Madam Chair.
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, if those are the guiding principles, then it would be helpful, again, leading up to the 2021 to then it'll be 2024 guideline, to formalize those as the guiding principles as staff work towards developing the next multi-year, 4-year multi-year budget.
Thank you, Mike. That's very helpful. Those 3 pillars were passed unanimously by this council, so I don't know how else we would realize them, or at least check our ability to realize part or all of them in the absence of having that discussion of feasibility. So I will move those to, when should I do that, Madam Chair Nan?
Madam Clerk?
You, Madam Deputy Mayor, if you are done the first time speakers list, any speaker can move a motion at any time.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move down to Councillor Pauls, and then Councillor Clark, then Councillor Jackson.
Thank you. Through the chair, just a simple question, and it's regarding tree planting. Do we have a bylaw? Where do we plant the trees to be proactive when, especially when they're planted near hydro or they're planted near a sewer and they cause damages? I've had few constituents call me about these problem trees. So I just want to ask, do we have where we plant them? How many meters from hydro? Through the chair, I don't know who wants to answer that, but.
I'm just waiting for Madam Deputy Mayor. Okay, through you, Madam Deputy Mayor. We do have a bylaw that states that the trees are planted in the city's road allowance. Now, the road allowance can vary depending on where it is in the city, if it's a rural cross-section, if it's urbanized. And it also takes into account when we send out investigators, what is the most suitable tree for the environment? Is it a windy location, sandy or clay soils? Could there be visual obstructions depending on where it's situated for cars or pedestrians? We try not to put trees that are really messy or drop heavy things, like black walnut, where there could be trees or pedestrians. So the bylaw doesn't speak to all those nuances, but the bylaw does speak to where it is located within the road allowance.
Thank you, because I've had few, even last week, about these trees that are causing problems. And it's interesting, I found out that Toronto has a law that they can't, it'd be 9 meters, it said. And I thought from whatever hydro is. Does that sound, unless I read it wrong, we don't have a bylaw that says it has to be 3 meters or from hydro? Because a lot of them, we have a lot of, hydro, that it's not working because these trees are falling on the hydro lines.
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, the bylaw doesn't speak to hydro lines specifically. Hydro has its own set of rules and laws about what can be within a certain center line of their wires. Now, we do have some wire-friendly trees that are very small. They don't get very tall, and so hydro allows us to plant those. That doesn't necessarily hit everything that was done historically, and what we have found is often residents, they don't consider the road allowance to be the city's property. They consider it to be theirs, and they can plant trees in the road allowance themselves, and sometimes they don't always pick the most suitable tree for the wires.
Thank you for that answer.
Thank you. Councillor Clark and then Councillor Jackson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. Just respect to the preservation of natural lands and natural heritage areas, I think we need to make sure that we recognize that we work with a lot of partners also, not just on the municipality side. So, for example, in 2008, this city council advocated strongly for the preservation of the Aramosa karst lands, which the province subsequently transferred to the Hamilton Conservation Area. In the following term, we advocated for the preservation of the Aramosa karst land feeder lands, which was doubling the size of the area. And I was instrumental in working with Minister Shirelli at the time to negotiate a lease where for $2 a year, those lands would be in perpetuity there for the Conservation Authority. So that was 78 hectares of new natural land that we added to our system in Hamilton. We also created the new Salt Fleet Conservation Area. I know Councillor Collins and Councillor Jackson and a few of my colleagues are sitting on that board with me. We took $2 million from the TerraPure royalties for the city and went to the Heritage Green Community Trust and asked if they would match that $2 million, and they did. And then the Conservation Authority added $750,000, and that purchased 72 hectares of land to preserve the natural areas. So that's over 140 hectares of land. And I also recall working with the Ontario Realty Corporation to preserve the Hamilton, a huge swath of additional land to the Felkers Conservation Area. So while it's challenging trying to flip land over that's designated as commercial or residential into a natural area, what we do is we work very hard with our partners to expand the natural area wherever possible to ensure that we're preserving as much natural lands as possible. And we have done more as a municipality than most municipalities in the province of Ontario with regards to that. So I'm very proud of that, and I don't want that to go by without commenting on that today. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Jackson.
I wasn't going to speak a second time, Madam Deputy Mayor, but just with Councillor Wilson, whatever motion she's going to put, listening carefully. Look, I said at the beginning of this term 11 months ago with our first capital and operating budget, when EDI, climate change, all of these pillars, as has been described, were brought forward. I made it clear, I'm trying to be as open-minded, as changeable as possible, very respectfully. But again, I said 11 months ago during, I believe, the first debate we had around this table, if this suddenly means going forward that absolutely zero growth is allowed and no more choice, and people, if they come to our city, will have to live in urban areas, downtown, repurposed landfill, repurposed old sites for intensification projects. If it means Rymal Road, 5-lane expansion, that is much necessary in my humble opinion, suddenly will be restricted, cannot go forward. If the purchase of the old school site Henderson Barton may not meet the test of these pillars, I'm sorry. I'm going to have serious reservations on behalf of the majority, I believe, of my constituents I represent. But again, Madam Deputy Mayor, I'm trying to be open-minded, I'm trying to listen, and I'm trying to be changeable, but within reason. So I just throw that caution on the table at this time, very respectfully. Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor.
Thank you for your comments, Councillor Jackson. I don't think that the motion, or from what perhaps my understanding of what Councillor Wilson was putting on the table is the items that you've listed are part of our 2020 capital budget deliberations, and they're part of what we are seeking to approve today. But I believe that Councillor Wilson's point was to be able to identify how the pillars are being prioritized in the budget process moving forward. So we have several things to vote on. Councillor Collins, are you indicating to put forward your amendment? Thank you.
Move that the approximately $2 million excess capital funding originally allocated to the Hamilton Police Service and the Hamilton Public Library Board be utilized as a funding source for the 2020 DC exemption pressure. And I think Mike had a part B in terms of a reporting back, but I would leave that to him and the clerk working out the appropriate wording on that.
So it's moved by yourself and seconded by Councillor, was it Clark? It's just what I recall when it was originally on the floor. All those in favor, please indicate electronic vote. It's approved. Unanimously moving to the next amending motion, clerk. Look to you. Councilor Marula?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And it's moved by myself and seconded by Councillor Collins. Whereas the Hamilton Public Library Board, at its meeting on November 20th, 2019, approved a supplementary 2020 capital budget request in the amount of $250,000 regarding a new mini branch library located within a new affordable housing development called Parkdale Landing in the Melvin Parkdale McQuestion area, Ward 4. Therefore, be it resolved that the 2020 capital request for the Parkdale Landing mini branch of $250,000 be funded from the development charges of $225,000 and library reserves of $25,000 with no net capital levy impact, and that the 2020 operating impact of the Parkdale Landing mini branch of $145,000 annualized be referred to City of Hamilton 2020 operating budget. And just quickly, as people can recall at the previous meeting, the library board had this on their agenda. They reached out to me with respect to what my appetite was for it. And I as you know, Parkdale Landing was a project that I actively pursued its development through Endwell. After the last election in 2014, it was one of my promises to remodel, reuse that area, and I was able to successfully do that through the help of Endwell, and they've been champions along the way. Having said that, they wouldn't have been able to do it without our support for a number of reasons. One, we did utilize Ward 4 area rating capital reserve funding, which opened up a significant amount of revenue from other partners, including the Community Foundation, which it was contingent upon the city's involvement, that they become involved. And I also brought forward a motion through committee that we seek out federal and provincial funding through the homelessness initiatives, which they were granted millions of dollars accordingly as a result of this council considering the project a priority. So in exchange of all of that, when Paul from the library, from Hamilton Public Library contacted me, I said, we have a vested interest on a number of fronts on this project. And the only thing I ask in return is that this will obviously serve the catchment area of Wards 3, 4, and 5, but also more importantly, in that particular area of McQuestion where we're going through a significant renaissance of creating a ratio of overly intensified homelessness or social problems with more of a socioeconomic diversity that we're creating there through a number of projects, and one of them being this Parkdale Landing project. So having said all of that, I understand that we're asking for additional operating funds, but the reason why I'm speaking in length is that understanding our pressures, we also do understand that that this type of service in that particular neighborhood, particularly as a result of the socioeconomic challenges, it's an investment and not a burden. And as a result, I probably move the motion that's before us, seconded by Councillor Collins, and I appreciate your time, and thank you.
Thank you. So on this motion, Councillor Danko?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you to staff, I mean, I certainly support the project. I'm just a little bit confused about the allocation of development charges through a motion. My understanding is that's typically not what we do. Through you to staff for comment.
Which staff?
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, if this motion were to be approved, we would amend the appendixes to the capital budget that are before you for deliberations consideration, so it would be formally reflected in the capital financing strategy that's before you for deliberations.
Just in general, when development charges are collected, they don't go towards specific projects from where they were charged. They go to a general reserve and then are allocated as those projects come up, and it's not necessarily a timing thing either. You can have development charges that were collected from a project years ago that go to financing projects that still haven't been done. For example, sidewalks in Ward 8 that haven't been put in. Through you, Madam Chair, I'm just, in this case, we're specifically allocating DCs to a specific project, and I just want to get a little bit more comfort with that, is how that works.
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, both of those comments are accurate in that the development charge reserves are funded through the collection of development charges, not against a particular property, but we just forecast a number of single detached units and non-residential square feet, and the funds are allocated according to effectively demand. And as it relates to the library board and library staff have identified this as a priority, and for that reason, we've identified it as a viable funding source, as it does incorporate a growth component.
So, through you, Madam Chair, so this specific project has been identified as a priority through the library board, so in that case, I can definitely support what's on the table. Thank you.
No further questions, so those in favor, please indicate. Electronic vote. Thank you, and that passes. So there's a call of the question on the capital budget. It was moved by the mayor and seconded by Councillor Marula. Clerk Paparella, there's two other motions. Are those separate from?
Councillor Wilson had announced that she had a motion, but the mayor's called the question. So I think he wants to hear the motion, though. He's indicating so.
Councillor Wilson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. My first motion is that that we ask staff to report back on the feasibility of achieving a healthy capital to operating ratio of 15 to 20% and a schedule for reaching such a ratio. I'm looking for a seconder. It's obviously moved by me.
Seconded by Councillor Marula.
Thank you, Sam. That's the first one. Should we vote on one at a time?
Okay. We could ask for it to be read at one more time.
Yep, of course. So the background is in your smaller tax budget on page 27 and onward. Point number 1, the capital levy as a percentage of the total levy is at 13.1%. A healthy capital to operating ratio is around 15 to 20%. That is where the pre-amalgamation ratio was for the combined city before reserve provision transfers were reduced. So my question for staff is that my request to them is that they report back on the feasibility of achieving that, getting back to that healthy capital to operating ratio and a schedule for reaching such a ratio.
Okay, clear? We have a question on the floor. Councillor Danko, and then Councillor Clark, and then Councillor Pearson.
Thank you, and well, I definitely support investment in infrastructure. It's the the core services we provide as a municipality. I just think this motion is premature at this time. I think we heard from staff, and staff can clarify that they will be, through their asset management program, looking at this very feasibility, and it's, I think, a fairly comprehensive review. So through to staff, just some follow-up on that through asset management, what that work will entail.
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, subject to what comes out of those deliberations as it relates to service levels and the associated financing plan, is there is a potential for the outcome being some additional funding requirement to align to those service levels. And I would simply say over and above that initiative is the report that was on the November agenda around facility roofs and the deficiency in investment, as well as our corporate security plan. Those are other examples whereby staff may be coming back with some additional capital funding requirements. So I would simply say is, and I expect traditionally there have been in-year issues as well, so all of those issues may lead to staff reporting back, moving off the 0.5% just as it relates, just to give committee some sense as to what it would represent to move from 13% to 15%, it would require about 16 million more in additional annual funding, which, for instance, could be achieved through a 1% capital levy increase over a 4-year period, 3 or 4-year period, annual, 1% annual increase. So the difference is about $16 million in annual funding.
Through you to General Manager McKinnon, my understanding is part of that process is setting service levels through asset management. So as part of that process, there will be an opportunity to come back with recommendations for funding increases where necessary, but those are directly related to the service levels that we will have an opportunity to set through this review, correct?
You, Madam Deputy Mayor, that's correct.
So I would suggest that that process is a better way forward and a more robust process for setting investments in infrastructure. So I'd suggest that that would probably be, what's the timeline for that, General Manager McKinnon? I know you're working on it right now.
You, Madam Deputy Mayor, the core assets, we're hopeful to get in front of you by 2021, and then the balance of all the assets is 23 to 24.
Thank you. Those are all my questions.
On the motion, Councillor Clark?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. So similarly to Councillor Danko's questions, do we have a timeline yet from the province with regards to the regulations regarding asset management?
Through the chair to you, Councillor. The timing for OREG 58817 is already defined. Our core asset, level of service, asset management plan needs to be back in front of council by 2021. And just to remind council, what we're going to bring back is your current level of service and your current expenditure. At that point in time, there's no decision around whether that expenditure increases or decreases depending on the level of service.
Thank you. And with regards to the province reviewing municipal property taxes legislation, do we have any ideas yet, Mr. Zagaric, on the timelines with regards to when that review is going to be started or finished?
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, just so that I understand the question, is this around the community benefit?
No, the Minister of Finance has announced he's now going to review municipal property taxes across the province.
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, I would expect that that will involve some consultation, and typically those processes tend to be 18-month to 24-month processes, but it would be subject to the level of consultation.
And finally, if this council could have afforded to move to the 15 or 20%, wouldn't we have actually done that?
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, is the 0.5%, council has been consistent in the 0.5% capital levy increase. And as I mentioned previously, the balancing as it relates to the increase of the capital levy versus the overall budget increase is we've tried to achieve some increased level of investment in capital while aligning to council's objective around tax affordability. So the 0.5%, and I know 0.5% doesn't sound like significant amount of funding, but 0.5% represents somewhere in the area of about $4.7 million in additional funding each and every year. And the capital levy increase has been increasing. The challenge that we have is that 0.5% over the past number of years, we've had competing and new initiatives that have come on, whether it was Emerald Ash Borer, whether it was Randall Reef, and so some of those initiatives crowd out the opportunity towards investing in what's referred to as core assets. And so that's represented a bit of the challenge historically.
And is that 0.5% compounded? Because it's 0.5% every year, so I'm assuming over time it's a compounding number.
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, yes, it is, and that's why staff always encouraged not to move far off that 0.5%. We did have to move off of it, I believe, during the recession. There was 1 year that we paused on it, but typically staff recommend not moving off of that 0.5% because of the compounding benefit.
So, Madam Deputy Mayor, I have been the biggest critic in terms of our roads need huge repairs. My colleagues have all heard me say that. We've been pushing the envelope as much as possible to make those repairs, but I'm also been very concerned about the level of taxation. And so you can't just arbitrarily increase the taxes up that dramatically without impacting people who really can't afford those taxes. So I'm comfortable that the advice that we've received over the years, we have been doing exactly what we should be doing. We're working through the asset management plan, which is a substantive, verifiable process, not politically driven, not parochial driven, but verifiable in terms of what actually needs to be done. And I think we should let that unfold. I agree with Councillor Danko.
Okay, so seeing no further comments or questions, the motion's on the floor. It's defeated. Moving forward, there was two other motions. So Councillor Wilson, you have one more, and then there's my motion.
Thank you. And I absolutely hear what Councillor Jackson is speaking of. I'm trying to be very sensitive to that, although I do, on principle, believe that for reasons of accountability and transparency, a framework would be important. So I'm trying to move forward in that vein respectfully. Whereas the 2019-2022 Council gave unanimous passage to the Vision Zero Action Plan, the creation of an equity, diversity, and inclusion net framework, and the declaration of a climate emergency. Therefore, that these three unanimous corporate pillars be part of a lens we use in our assessment of capital priorities, along with asset management and state of good repair. Just part of our deliberation, Councillor Jackson.
Moved by Councillor Wilson, seconded by Councillor Marula. Mayor Eisenberger.
Madam Chair, I would refer that motion to the 2021 capital budget process for discussion and review. That's my motion.
To refer the motion for 2021 capital budget and review. Clerk.
Madam Deputy Mayor, we're just going to defer it because we're already in a budget.
Defer.
So we're just going to defer it.
Okay.
And that takes precedence.
Deferral motion takes precedence. Okay, so we're voting on deferring the motion. Councillor Pearson, you have a question, comment? Oh, my apologies. 1 second. Just need to clear the 2021 capital budget process.
Thank you.
And just a quick check-in. Councillor Wilson, that wasn't your intention to have it in the 2021 capital budget process? Sorry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It was my intent for that exercise moving forward.
Okay, just sorry. Mr. Jolie, catching up. I stand corrected. Thank you very much. Learning procedure as I'm going. Let's go. Vote.
Moved by the mayor,
the deferral.
seconded by. Moved by the mayor, seconded by. Sorry. Thank you.
On the main motion. Oh, no, the deferral stands. So the motion moves to being deferred. And then the final motion, I'll have to pass the chair. Is that correct, clerk? Yes. Okay. To Councillor Wilson, moved by myself, I'll need a seconder, that staff be directed to review the feasibility of the municipality imposing a tax, fee, or charge on vacant residential properties to encourage occupation of those properties and report back to GIC in the 2021 budget process. Councillor Pearson? Wilson's in the chair, I apologize.
Chair, I'm sorry. Okay, thank you. Can staff please clarify, because I believe we just removed the vacant tax rebate. So it's 100% now on any vacant properties. They pay tax just like anybody else of what the rate that they're charged a year. They get no relief from taxation because it's a vacant property. Through Madam Chair to Mr. Zagarek.
Through the chair, as I understand the motion isn't, I think Councillor Pearson's referring to the vacant commercial tax rebate that we have phased out. As I understand the motion is the feasibility of the municipality having the right to impose a fee, charge, or tax on any vacant residential units. So where a unit might have been acquired as an investment but sits vacant, it's not occupied, whether or not the municipality has the right to impose a fee or charge. I'm not aware. We haven't investigated this. I'm just simply not aware whether or not we have the right to impose a fee, charge, or tax on any vacant residential units.
So it would be a fee. I'm sorry then, because I just want clarification what I'm voting on, because it doesn't matter if the property's vacant, you still pay tax on it. So I'm assuming it's to set a fee. Through Madam Chair, if the mover wants to just clarify, I'd appreciate it.
Sure, Councillor Pearson, I'd be happy to clarify. So it's in response to our housing and deep affordable housing needs and crisis in the city. So in other municipalities where residential properties remain vacant, they are vacant. And so they are not part of the pool of renting, and it contributes to exacerbating the problem of affordable units that are available to tenants who are being pushed out of the housing market, and also property taxes like this one, particularly a vacant resident property tax or charge, is used as an instrument by municipalities to encourage occupation of vacant units. So that's the intent and purpose behind this motion.
Or I think Madam Clerk wants to jump in. Go ahead, Madam Clerk.
My apologies. Do you have a seconder? I didn't hear the second.
Councillor Marula.
Oh, it was Councillor Marula? Okay, thank you.
I still have concerns because, I mean, there's got to be reasons properties are being vacant. And I don't know that, I mean, are we circumventing that? Are we telling staff to come back and say, well, I mean, how do you determine, you know, somebody may be working on renovations and sure, it's vacant. It could be vacant for any extended period of time. They could be working on a change of use through the planning process. There's so many things that could be occurring. You know, I would say that they pay the current rate as it is. I don't know if that's going to achieve, I don't know that that's going to achieve getting more housing available to citizens in Hamilton. Thank you.
Oh, I'm up next then.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. Can you state your motion again?
Sure. That staff be directed to review the feasibility of this municipality imposing a tax, fee, or charge on vacant residential properties to encourage occupation of those properties and report back to GIC in the 2021 budget process.
So through you, Acting Chair, to Mike or Jason, I guess, the vacant building registry, is that program, I think it's been around 7 years or so, 6 years maybe now, is still robust and functioning well?
Mr. Thorne?
Yes, so through the chair, the city does have the vacant building program. In that program, there is a fee charged, but that is for that covers the quarterly inspection costs of making sure that those buildings are properly secured. So that's different from what I understand the Vancouver program is, which is a additional property tax or surcharge for units that are kept off the market for a certain period of time. I can't remember the exact duration. I think it's something like if it's more than 6 months or more than a year of vacancy, then the additional charge applies. So it's a little bit different than what our vacant building registry covers.
I understand. I just wanted to, make certain that at the very least we're monitoring those vacant buildings. And if we're monitoring, if we have the vacant building registry, we have a much better, and we've had it for some years now, we have a much better idea of where these vacant buildings are. Through you, Chair, do we have any idea of the number? Even an approximate is fine.
So through the chair, I believe it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 buildings that we've identified as being vacant. Not all of them are always on the registry, so as we identify buildings that are vacant but not on the registry, we do issue enforcement and require them to go on the registry. So I think at any given time, we're somewhere around 300 that are actually registered in the program.
Through you, Deputy Chair, how many commercial, how many residential?
Through the chair, that I don't have. I would have to get back to you with that.
I'm intrigued by the motion, I really am. I want to support it, actually, but I'm wondering if, I'm feeling pressed to make the decision now with all the other things, but I'll tell you what, it looks like we have a few more speakers. I really do appreciate where it's coming from, though, so I'm going to give it some thought. Thank you.
Councillor Danko.
Thank you. And just reflecting on the experience in Vancouver, where there's a booming housing market, and people are purchasing a property, residential property, never intending to live there, simply letting it sit on the market as an investment. It's a massive, massive problem in Vancouver. It drives up rents. It takes units off the market, and in particular, it really affects young people who want to move to a city, and the housing market is being driven by speculation, and they have zero chance of ever entering that market. And I know that the program in Vancouver, my sister and some of my family live there. It's been a huge success, and it's seen as somewhat of an equalizer to the playing field, because it's just not fair to young people who are trying to get into what we all took for granted in buying a home for our families, and having no chance to enter the market because of speculation in property. And in particular, people at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum just get hit by real estate speculation so hard. So, I mean, we know this is a problem in Vancouver. We know it's a problem in Toronto, Montreal, other large urban centers in Canada and around the world, frankly. So there's every reason to believe that we'd have a similar problem in Hamilton, perhaps not to the level of Vancouver and other cities, but I mean, just anecdotally, you can see it growing in Ward 8 in particular. Just speaking in my own area, I know there are quite a number of residential properties that people have bought as real estate speculation and have no intention of living there or renting them out. They just sit on the property. And as a city, as we develop more and more multi-res, there's every reason to believe that this will be a growing problem as well. And some of those properties end up as Airbnb or other sharing type rental situations. So, I mean, I definitely support this direction to at least investigate, what the scope of the problem could be in Hamilton, and what potential revenue, fixes might be available to us. So, strongly supportive. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Clark?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate that. So can I just ask staff, how do we know which apartments are empty? I'm not aware of any mechanism utilized by the municipality to actually track the number of empty apartments. We get vacancy reports from the Realtors Association, but do we track them?
Mr. Thorne, are you able to help us?
Through the chair, we don't at this time. For the vacant building registry, it is a vacant building, so it's not a vacant unit within a building. That's a little bit easier to determine and to enforce. I'm not sure what the mechanism would be for tracking individual unit vacancies. I'm not sure what mechanism Vancouver is using, but I think that would have to be part of the feasibility if we're going to look at this, is how we would actually track unit vacancies.
And what's the ratio between multi-residential high-rises versus multiplexes?
Through the chair, if I understand the question correctly, and I'm going from memory here, but for new construction, we're currently in about, we tend to be in around 35-40% of new construction is in multi-residential form. In terms of the overall supply on the City of Hamilton housing market, I don't have that off the top of my head. Do we even know? How
many triplexes, fourplexes, duplexes?
Through the chair, we would be able to determine through tax rolls what we have in the multi-residential category. I can't remember the exact cutoff of where the multi-residential category kicks in terms of number of units, but we'd be able to break it down to that extent. To get all the way down to duplexes, triplexes, I'm not sure if we would be able to determine that through tax roll.
I guess the challenge I'm having is I really don't have any background. I don't know if it's a real issue in Hamilton. I don't know what Vancouver has done or Toronto or any other municipalities. I was not given any heads up that this motion was coming, so I couldn't do any rudimentary research. So I'm in a bit of a box here. I don't like directing staff to go out and search on something when we haven't done at least some modicum of preliminary work to understand what the issue is that we're trying to solve. So I'll listen to the rest of my colleagues.
Councillor Marula?
Just quickly, I think I agree with everything I'm hearing on both ends of this issue. I think it's important to recognize that this motion is a good one in that I think it's very proactive. We might not be where Toronto and Vancouver are, but we're definitely headed that way. So I think it's important that we get ahead of this issue so that we can at least be prepared for what inevitably will occur. And anecdotally, I'm speaking with a number of developers. I've been told that more and more often, any type of development, particularly multi-residential developments, people are buying blocks. They'll buy 2, 3, 4 condominiums, and they're sitting on them. And then they'll flip them later, whether they flip them a year, 2, 3, 5 years from now, who knows? But at the end of the day, they are buying in bulk. And if they're buying in bulk, that means they know that the market's headed a certain way, and that normally means north. So I like the motion. I probably second it, and I think, granted, we could have used some notice ahead of time, but in all fairness, I've done this before in the past, so I can't criticize it. So that's why I support it. Thank you.
Mayor Eisenberger?
So I'm keenly interested in quantifying the scope and the scale of the problem. I think that's kind of priority number one. I think there's some other priorities that we need to focus on, Airbnb being one of them, and I know that staff are coming forward with a report. I think that's a more significant, imminent problem, quite frankly. But I see no harm in getting some preliminary information about the scope and scale of what might be happening out there in the market. So I'll support the motion. I think it would be helpful, though, to have a bit more of a heads up on these motions, so we can put some forethought into how we're going to deal with them going forward. I think that's always helpful, and I think in many instances we have people put forward a motion and send it off to council saying, I intend to do this at this particular meeting upcoming. I think that's reasonable and fair. So I would highly recommend that we maintain that practice in the future, because I think that's respectful to all members of council, so that we can all put some thought into what we're going to be dealing with on a given day. This motion I'll support, but again, I look forward to much more the Airbnb recommendations that are coming. I believe in January. I really start to define homes that offer up rooms as opposed to entire buildings turned into Airbnb, which is a really big problem in many of the same centers that we're talking about, and coming our way, and probably in a significant way coming up pretty soon. So there are many things that we need to do to guard our rental housing stock. This may be one of them, so I'll support the motion.
I don't have any other speakers, so the motion is on the floor. It's moved by Deputy Mayor.
I will read
Deputy Mayor, could you reread it for us, please?
And if I could, just make some final comments once I reread it. So the staff be directed to review the feasibility of the municipality imposing a tax fee or charge on vacant residential properties to encourage occupation of those properties and report back to GIC. The original motion said to report back to GIC in 2021 budget process. If it's the will of committee members to receive the information portion in advance of the budget process versus in the budget process, I am open to that kind of amendment. I also like many of us, do often advance motions that I intend to raise. I literally was texting and emailing over the course of the weekend and saw it fit to bring it forward in this process, and will maintain putting forward my intentions and letting councillor colleagues know in advance when I'm developing something in advance. But sometimes ideas just come on the fly, and I do appreciate committee's will in entertaining me that right.
Thank you. There's a motion on the floor. Councillor Pearson, did you have a question on the motion?
Ask Madam Clerk that I more than likely should declare a conflict because now it's relating to rental housing and residential, and I am a landlord. Thank you.
You can't second it.
Sorry, so there's been a declaration, and I hear another declaration, so you can get your necessary papers for that purpose, and you'll need a new seconder, which I can take the place of Mr. Arula. And Mayor Eisenberger, did you have a comment or question on the motion?
Yeah. So I'm trying to understand how this ties to the capital budget, which is what we're going to be deciding on right now. I don't think they're tied together, so I would highly recommend that we deal with this motion separate and apart from the capital budget. Approve the capital budget, and then we can deal with this motion, which really isn't a capital budget issue.
Councillor Vanderbeek, did you have a comment, question on the motion, or on the comment that Mayor Eisenberger just?
No, I was the next speaker, and then I was removed. And so I was asking, why did she take me off? Because she's the one in charge of the mics. So I too need to declare a conflict because I am a landlord and I have rental property. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Marula?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just quickly, I have to declare an interest to prevent the conflict, and I'm glad that someone did mention it. Although it's punitive in many ways on the landlord, that regardless if it's punitive or not, it's still an interest because I am a landlord. And because it was brought to my attention now, I'm declaring it. Thank you.
Councillor Clark, on the mayor's direction or the motion?
On the motion to staff, Mr. Thorne specifically, so as you understand the motion that is before us, in any way, shape, or form, is it going to be related to licensing of rental housing?
Mr. Thorne?
Through the chair, I wouldn't think so because the licensing program is speaking to all rental housing, whereas this is looking at specifically a fee or tax on vacant units. At this moment, I'm not seeing what a direct connection might be. So I would suggest that no, the licensing program would be independent. It could be a standalone program, regardless of whether or not there's a fee that's proposed on vacant residential buildings.
Thank you. I've declared conflicts throughout the year with regards to anything dealing with the licensing side, so I just want to make sure.
Thank you. Councillor Johnson.
Thank you. I'm with the mayor. Why is this being discussed now at Capitol? So can we please shelve this motion? Let's get the capital portion done. That's my suggestion. Thank you. That's just process.
So Mayor Eisenberger has a motion to...
Councillor Farr.
I am most supportive. Interesting conversation over the last 10 minutes about not throwing anybody curveballs in debates, and sometimes things just come to mind. This is one that I'm leaving in abeyance because I did not want to bring it here today, but I just wanted to put particularly my Public Works colleagues on notice on page 79 of Book 1. 4 lines down on the parks and cemeteries. You don't need to go to it. Cemetery development, green burials, as you know, I've been a strong proponent for many years. Last year during the capital budget process. We tabled it to this year. Not long ago, SMT met and suggested that it's remain unfunded, and I'm going to bring forward a funding plan on a capital nature to a Public Works meeting.
I'm getting direction from
What direction are you getting?
that there is a motion on the floor. It's been moved and seconded.
Yeah, for the capital budget.
Capital budget.
Right?
No, call the question.
And to call the.
Oh, you called I'm so
I
sorry.
apologize.
We'll talk about it in Public Works in a few months. Just
In
wanted
passing
to
off the
keep you apprised.
the
I didn't hear the call
microphone
the
as chair
question.
back and forth, so assuming the chair and moving.
Sorry about that.
Question's been called on the budget, so we're going to proceed with the vote. Those in favor, those opposed, please indicate electronically. Councillor Wilson, Councillor Farr. Now we're on the, we called the question, that's right. So we're voting on the budget as is, right? Okay. Councillor Wilson, if you can indicate, I'll recognize you after the vote is done. This is on the budget, correct. As amended with Councillor Collins' amendment. Thank you. The capital budget passes. And now there were two speakers who had indicated, Councillor Farr, Councillor Wilson, and then we still have, okay.
You, Madam
You're
Deputy
done.
Mayor.
Okay.
Sorry,
you.
Deputy Mayor, we have actually approved the budget now, so the speaker's list is closed for that
Got it,
item.
thank you. And then are we back to this motion?
Yes, now your motion is on the floor.
Okay, so the motion about the vacant residential properties is on the floor. So again, reading it final time, that staff be directed to review the feasibility of the municipality imposing a tax fee or charge on vacant residential properties to encourage occupation of those properties and report back to GIC. Motion's on the floor. Moved by myself, seconded by Wilson. Those who have conflicts, please indicate. Thank you, I appreciate that. And may I please get a motion to,
Okay, I'm going to cancel this vote. Please pay attention when we're voting. Thank you.
Clerk, General Manager Zagaric would like to speak. So just 1 minute, folks, if we can.
Hang on, because, Madam Deputy Mayor, can we finish what we're doing first?
Do the vote?
That vote
After
is
the vote.
spoiled.
After the vote is General Manager Zagaric, sorry. Chad, you have to come back in the room to vote. One more time.
Yes, really.
Again, those in favor, please indicate electronically. Those opposed, please indicate electronically. Those with conflicts, please indicate electronically. Motion is before you for vote. Thank you. There we go. And General Manager Zagaric had a quick item.
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, just a comment and then maybe a question is to Councillor Jackson's earlier question as to which projects comprise the other component. There are about 60 projects, so rather than recite those, we will send an email to all committee members as to what projects make up that just short of $25 million. And if I could just ask on the mayor's deferral motion, is it the intent that we come back during the 21 budget process as to how a climate change EDI Vision Zero lens may be applied to budget discussions?
So I'm just deferring the motion that, in upcoming 2021 budget year, we're going to have a discussion around the prioritization of the issues that are going to drive the 2021 capital budget.
The motion itself, Mike, was deferred.
May I please have a motion to adjourn? Moved by Wilson, seconded by Partridge. All those in favor? Have a great rest of your day.